Black River Falls, Wisconsin, February 1891. While his neighbors shivered through another brutal winter night, burning through cord after cord of split oak just to keep their families from freezing, one man slept in absolute comfort. Not by the fire, not wrapped in every blanket he owned, but 6 feet below ground level, in what the locals had mockingly called his grave bed. They'd laughed at him all through the previous summer, called him touched in the head, said he was wasting precious labor digging when he should have been building up, not down. The town's most experienced carpenter had publicly declared it the stupidest thing I've seen in 40 years of frontier building. But on that February night, when temperatures plummeted to 23 degrees below zero, something remarkable happened. Something that would force an entire community to reconsider everything they thought they knew about surviving winter. Before we reveal what this Wisconsin homesteader understood about thermal physics that even experienced builders missed, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because I guarantee the principles we're about to discuss apply, whether you're in Montana, Manitoba, or Maine. Stay until the end, and you'll understand why modern off-gridders are rediscovering this 130-year-old technique that could cut your heating costs in half. Lars Eriksson wasn't supposed to be a revolutionary. He was supposed to be a cautious Norwegian immigrant doing what every other homesteader did: build a standard 16 by 20 log cabin, install a corner fireplace, and hope you cut enough wood to last the winter. But in May of 1890, something happened that made the entire settlement of Black River Falls question his sanity. Instead of raising walls, Lars started digging. Down through 2 feet of topsoil, through clay, into the dense, packed earth that had remained undisturbed since the glaciers retreated 10,000 years earlier. Day after day, neighbors watched him excavate what looked like a root cellar, except it was directly beneath where his sleeping area would be. "Man's digging his own grave," observed Thomas Bradley, a master carpenter from Vermont who'd built 17 cabins in the Wisconsin Territory. Bradley had seen plenty of foolish ideas from greenhorn settlers, but this took the prize. Ground's cold and damp. He'll catch pneumonia by Christmas. The local Norwegian community was equally baffled. Back in the old country, you built thick stone walls and massive fireplaces. You didn't burrow into the earth like a badger. Even Lars's own uncle, who'd homesteaded 3 miles north, tried to talk sense into him. "The frost line goes down 4 feet here," his uncle warned. "You'll be sleeping on ice." But Lars kept digging. 6 feet down. Then he did something that seemed even more inexplicable. He began hauling river stones. Hundreds of them. Smooth, rounded glacial cobbles ranging from fist size to the dimensions of a man's head. He lined the entire pit with these stones, creating what looked like a well shaft. Then he mortared them with clay mixed with sand and lime. The structure taking shape was bizarre by any frontier standard. The excavation extended 8 feet by 6 feet, generous sleeping space for 2 people. But instead of leaving it as a simple dugout, Lars was building thermal infrastructure that wouldn't be understood for another generation. He installed hand-hewn timbers across the top of the stone-lined pit, creating a ceiling that would sit flush with his cabin's floor. Then he cut a trapdoor opening, constructing a ladder that descended into what the townspeople now openly called Eriksson's folly. "Waste of 2 months' labor," declared Bradley to anyone who'd listen. "That Norwegian's gonna freeze to death in his own hole while trying to save a few logs." What none of them understood, what Lars had learned from winter hunting camps in the mountains of Norway, was that the earth itself was the most efficient thermal battery ever created, and he was about to prove it in the most dramatic way possible. While Thomas Bradley and the other experienced builders focused on what was visible: wall thickness, fireplace size, chimney draft, Lars Eriksson understood something far more fundamental about heat and cold. The earth, 6 feet down, maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round. In Wisconsin, that temperature hovers between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of whether the air above is 90 degrees in July or 30 below zero in January. This wasn't folklore. It was physics that every root cellar depended on, every spring house utilized, every experienced well digger knew by instinct. But Lars was doing something no one else had attempted: sleeping in that stable thermal zone. His stone-lined chamber wasn't just a hole in the ground. Those river rocks, collectively weighing over 3,000 pounds, acted as thermal mass. During the day, any heat that filtered down from the cabin above would be absorbed and stored by the stone. At night, that heat would radiate back slowly, steadily, maintaining temperature equilibrium. The chamber's walls were 18 inches thick of mortared stone. The clay-sand-lime mixture between the rocks created an airtight seal that prevented moisture infiltration while allowing the Earth's natural temperature to dominate the space. Above the timbers that formed the ceiling, Lars had packed 8 inches of dry sawdust, the frontier's best insulation material, trapping air in millions of tiny pockets. To manage air quality, he'd installed a simple but clever ventilation system. A 4-inch diameter pipe made from hollowed sumac stems, running from the chamber up through the cabin floor near the fireplace. Warm air from the main living space would naturally draw down, while the chamber's slightly cooler, denser air would circulate out. Not enough to lose heat, but enough to prevent stuffiness and maintain oxygen levels. The mathematics were elegant. If the ground maintained 47 degrees, and Lars could prevent heat loss through his insulated ceiling, his sleeping chamber would stabilize somewhere between ground temperature and whatever warmth filtered down from above. Even if the cabin above cooled to 40 degrees overnight, a common occurrence when fires burned down, the chamber below would remain significantly warmer. But Thomas Bradley wasn't interested in mathematics. "I've built in Maine, Michigan, and Minnesota," he announced at the general store in October 1890. "And I've never seen anyone sleep underground who didn't regret it. That boy's going to wake up with consumption, mark my words." The town's doctor agreed. Damp air, poor circulation, breathing your own exhalations all night. It's a recipe for lung disease. Even the local Norwegian immigrants, who should have understood earth-sheltered construction from their sod-roofed mountain huts, sided with the skeptics. America was supposed to be about progress, about building up and out, not retreating into the ground like their impoverished ancestors. Lars, for his part, said little. He finished his cabin's above-ground structure in November, a modest but well-built log home with a standard corner fireplace. The only unusual feature was the trapdoor in the floor near the back wall, and the ladder descending into darkness. "That trapdoor is going to be the most expensive firewood you ever cut," Bradley told him the day before the first serious cold snap. "You watch. Come January, you'll be sealing that hole and sleeping by the fire like everyone else." Lars just smiled. He'd already spent 2 nights in his underground chamber during mild November weather. The temperature down there had been a steady 51 degrees, requiring only a single wool blanket for comfort. Above ground, the cabin had dipped to 38 degrees as the fire died during the night. The real test was coming, and it would arrive sooner than anyone expected. January 11th, 1891. The temperature at sunrise was 4 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, it had dropped to 0. By sunset, the mercury in Thomas Bradley's thermometer, one of only 3 in Black River Falls, showed 12 below, and it kept falling. Lars Eriksson banked his fire at 8 o'clock that evening, as he always did. He added several large oak logs that would burn slowly through the night, maintaining enough heat in the main cabin to prevent water buckets from freezing solid. Then he descended the ladder into his underground chamber, pulling the insulated trapdoor closed behind him. Above ground, his neighbors were fighting a desperate battle against the cold. Thomas Bradley stoked his fireplace every 2 hours, burning through nearly half a cord of wood in a single night. The Anderson family, 3 cabins down, huddled together in a single bed pulled close to their hearth, children wrapped in every available blanket. Old Gunther Schmidt, who'd survived 40 Wisconsin winters, sat in a chair by his fire all night, too cold to risk sleeping. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the outdoor temperature had reached 23 degrees below 0, the coldest night in Black River Falls' recorded history. In Bradley's cabin, despite the roaring fire, the temperature 10 feet from the hearth had dropped to 34 degrees. Frost formed on the inside of his shuttered windows. His breath created visible clouds. He burned through another armload of split oak, calculating grimly that at this rate, he'd exhaust his winter wood supply by early February. In Lars Eriksson's cabin above ground, the situation was similar. The fire had burned down to coals by 4 a.m. The main room temperature had fallen to 28 degrees. Ice crystals formed where moisture had collected on the logs near the door. But 6 feet below, in that stone-lined chamber, Lars Eriksson slept comfortably under a single wool blanket and a quilt. The temperature in his sleeping space had stabilized at exactly 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 42 degrees warmer than the cabin above him, 54 degrees warmer than Bradley's sleeping area, 77 degrees warmer than the frozen world outside. If you're finding value in this story, hit that like button now and subscribe, because we're about to break down exactly why this worked and how you could apply these principles to modern off-grid living. Drop a comment with your location so we know where our community of frontier wisdom enthusiasts is watching from. The next morning, when Lars emerged from his chamber at first light, he found Thomas Bradley and 4 other neighbors gathered outside his cabin. They'd seen smoke from his chimney, proof his fire had burned down like everyone else's, but they'd also noticed Lars looked rested. No dark circles under his eyes, no violent shivering, no desperate rush to rebuild the fire. "How'd you sleep?" Bradley asked, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. "Quite well," Lars replied. 54 degrees down there. Didn't even need my heavy quilt." Bradley's face went from skeptical to stunned. He'd burned through more wood in one night than Lars typically used in a week, and had still nearly frozen. Meanwhile, the Norwegian immigrant they'd all mocked had slept in shirt-sleeve comfort. "That's impossible," Bradley said. But his tone had changed. This wasn't dismissal anymore. It was the desperate interest of a man who'd just realized he might have been wrong about something important. "The Earth," Lars explained simply, "doesn't care what the air does. 6 feet down, it's always about the same temperature. Stone holds that temperature. Insulation keeps my body heat from escaping. Nothing complicated." Over the next week, as the cold snap persisted, the evidence became undeniable. Lars burned 1/3 the wood his neighbors consumed. He slept soundly every night. And most tellingly, he didn't show the exhaustion, irritability, and poor health that chronic cold exposure caused in everyone else. By late January, Thomas Bradley asked if he could spend one night in the chamber. Lars agreed. The carpenter descended the ladder skeptically, wrapped in heavy furs, convinced he'd be shivering within an hour. He emerged the next morning converted. "I've been building wrong for 40 years, he admitted to the gathered crowd. That Norwegian solved winter. What Lars Eriksson had accomplished wasn't magic. It was applied thermodynamics, executed with frontier materials and immigrant ingenuity. The key was understanding 3 principles that modern builders would later codify, but that Lars grasped intuitively. First, ground source thermal stability. Below the frost line, Earth temperature is governed not by daily or even seasonal air temperature, but by the average annual temperature of the region. In Wisconsin, that meant 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. This is why root cellars keep potatoes from freezing in winter and cool in summer. Why pioneers dug wells that never iced over. Why burial sites below frost line never heave. Lars's chamber sat precisely in this zone. The 3,000 pounds of stone lining the walls acted as thermal mass, absorbing, storing, and slowly releasing the Earth's constant temperature. Stone has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Those river rocks could store and release approximately 600 BTUs for every degree of temperature change, enough thermal battery capacity to stabilize the space against minor fluctuations. Second, insulation prevents heat loss, not heat gain. Above ground, frontier cabins fought a losing battle. Log walls, even well-chinked, leaked heat constantly. Every crack, every gap around doors and windows, every spot where wind penetrated, they all bled warmth into the frozen air. Settlers compensated by burning enormous amounts of wood, essentially heating the outdoors as much as the indoors. Lars's chamber had none of these problems. The earth itself was insulation, hundreds of tons of it, surrounding his sleeping space on 5 sides. The only potential heat loss was through the ceiling, and he'd sealed that with 8 inches of sawdust under the floorboards. His body heat, minimal as it was, had nowhere to go. Combined with the ground's stable temperature, this created a system that needed almost no energy input to maintain comfort. Third, thermal comfort is about radiant temperature, not just air temperature. Modern HVAC engineers know that human comfort depends on mean radiant temperature, the average temperature of all surfaces around you, not just air temperature. This is why 68 degrees in a modern insulated home feels comfortable, while 68 degrees in a poorly insulated house with cold walls feels chilly. In Lars's chamber, every surface radiated at approximately 52 to 54 degrees. The stone walls, the timber ceiling, even the dirt floor he'd covered with flat rocks and sheepskins. His body never experienced the radiant heat loss that made sleeping in a cold cabin so miserable. He wasn't fighting to keep warm. The environment was already warm enough. By February of 1891, Thomas Bradley had calculated the numbers that would convince even the skeptics. During the January cold snap, Lars burned an average of 18 pounds of wood per night to maintain his above-ground cabin at livable temperature during the day. Bradley burned 47 pounds of wood per night to keep his cabin warm enough for sleeping. Lars slept in 54-degree comfort, requiring one wool blanket. Bradley, despite burning nearly 3 times as much wood, slept in 34-degree conditions requiring multiple heavy quilts and fur blankets. Over the 5 coldest weeks of winter, Lars consumed 630 pounds of wood. Bradley burned through 1,645 pounds. Lars's wood savings translated to approximately 40 hours of labor, an entire week that he could spend on other survival tasks. But the efficiency wasn't the only benefit. The health differences were dramatic. Chronic cold exposure suppresses immune function, disrupts sleep, increases cardiovascular strain, and causes cumulative exhaustion. By late February, most of Black River Falls' residents were gaunt, exhausted, and fighting respiratory infections. Lars looked healthy, rested. His children, who slept in conventional beds above ground but benefited from the reduced wood consumption and their father's better rest, were thriving. The doctor who'd warned about consumption and damp air grudgingly admitted that the chamber showed no signs of excess moisture. The ventilation system, crude as it was, proved adequate, and Lars's lungs sounded clear as a bell. "I was wrong," the doctor told the town council in March. "Completely wrong. That chamber is drier than most of our cabins, warmer than any of them, and appears to have no health detriments whatsoever." By spring thaw, 7 families had approached Lars asking for advice on building their own basement beds. The revolution had begun. Summer of 1891 saw a transformation in Black River Falls. What had been mockery turned to curiosity, then to wholesale adoption. But as with any good idea, the implementation varied. Thomas Bradley, ever the craftsman, built the most elaborate version. He excavated an 8 by 10 chamber, lined it with fitted limestone blocks hauled from a quarry 15 miles away, and installed a ventilation system with copper piping salvaged from an abandoned mine. His chamber included built-in stone sleeping platforms that would radiate residual warmth throughout the night. Total project: 6 weeks of labor and considerable expense. The Anderson family, with more children than money, took a simpler approach. They dug directly under their existing cabin's floor, removing boards and excavating in sections to avoid undermining the structure. Their chamber was only 5 feet deep, not quite to Lars's standard, but they lined it with field stone and insulated above with a mixture of sawdust and dried moss. Less efficient than Lars's design, but it still maintained 48-degree temperatures during the following winter. For a family that had nearly frozen the previous January, it was salvation. Old Gunther Schmidt created perhaps the most interesting variation. Too old to dig extensively, he compromised. He excavated only 3 feet down, but then built up stone walls another 2 feet above ground level inside his cabin, creating a half-sunken sleeping chamber. He covered the entire structure with a thick layer of earth and sod, essentially building a raised root cellar that he slept in. The Earth's thermal mass, even with less burial depth, still provided remarkable insulation. Schmidt reported sleeping in 49-degree comfort, while his main cabin, dropped below freezing. By winter of 1891 to 1892, 11 families in Black River Falls had some version of an underground sleeping chamber. The results were consistent. Dramatic reductions in wood consumption, better sleep quality, improved winter health, and most importantly, genuine thermal comfort during the coldest nights. Word spread beyond the immediate community. Traveling peddlers carried tales of the Norwegian grave beds that kept people warmer than fires. The story, sensationalized and sometimes garbled, reached Norwegian settlements in Minnesota, Swedish communities in the Dakota Territory, and German homesteaders in Iowa. Not everyone who heard the story implemented it correctly. Some excavated too shallow, failing to reach the thermal stability zone. Others built without proper ventilation and did indeed create damp, unhealthy spaces. A few tried to use the chambers year-round and found them uncomfortably cool in summer. Lars only used his from October through April, sleeping above ground during warm months. But for those who followed Lars's basic principles, depth below frost line, thermal mass, proper insulation above, adequate ventilation, the results were consistent and remarkable. By 1893, Thomas Bradley had documented 23 basement bed installations within a 50-mile radius of Black River Falls. His notebook, preserved in the Wisconsin Historical Society archives, includes sketches, measurements, and testimonials. One entry from February 1893 is particularly telling. The Haugen family, newly arrived from Norway, requested consultation on their cabin design. I advised excavating a sleeping chamber per Ericsson's principles. They were skeptical, having never seen such construction in the old country, but agreed. This winter, during the blizzard of January 18th, when temperatures reached 29 below, Mrs. Haugen reported the chamber remained at 52 degrees. She wrote to relatives in Trondheim describing the technique. I wonder if someday this Wisconsin innovation will spread back to Norway itself. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A technique inspired by Norwegian mountain wisdom, adapted to Wisconsin conditions, was now being recommended back to Norwegians as an American frontier innovation. Lars Ericsson, characteristically modest, claimed no special credit. I just remember how the earth stays warm, he'd say, and figure a man could sleep in that warmth instead of fighting the air. But his impact was undeniable. In an era when winter survival often meant choosing between exhausting your wood supply or enduring dangerous cold, he provided a third option: use the Earth's own thermal battery. Let physics do the work that muscle and firewood have been doing. It was engineering disguised as common sense. And it worked exactly as well as the math said it should. The story of Lars Ericsson's basement bed didn't end in the Wisconsin frontier. It echoed something far older, far more universal than one Norwegian immigrant's clever solution to winter cold. Across human history, whenever people faced extreme cold without abundant fuel, they discovered the same fundamental truth. The earth itself is a furnace. Not hot, but stable. Not powerful, but reliable. And in survival, reliability matters more than intensity. In Korea, the Ondal system had kept families warm for over 1,000 years. Heated floors built over stone channels that stored and radiated warmth from a single modest fire. The principle was identical to what Lars discovered: thermal mass, insulation, and positioning people in the stable heat zone rather than the fluctuating air above. In the American Southwest, ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings and pit houses that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter by utilizing the Earth's constant temperature. Their kivas, ceremonial chambers sunk into the ground, maintained comfortable conditions year-round without any heating system at all. The Inuit, facing far more extreme conditions than Wisconsin ever produced, understood that snow itself was insulation. An igloo's interior, warmed only by body heat and a small seal oil lamp, could maintain 60-degree temperatures while outside winds howled at 40 below zero. The principle wasn't fighting the cold with heat. It was creating a stable microenvironment protected from temperature extremes. Even in Northern Europe, the very region Lars Ericsson emigrated from, turf houses with thick sod roofs and partially buried walls had kept families comfortable through centuries of harsh winters. These weren't primitive hovels. They were sophisticated applications of thermal physics, built by people who understood that the Earth's embrace was warmer than the winter sky's indifference. What made Lars's achievement remarkable wasn't that he invented something new. It was that he remembered something old in a time and place where everyone else had forgotten. The Wisconsin frontier of 1890 represented a peculiar moment in technological history. Settlers had enough industrial capacity to produce cast-iron stoves, milled lumber, and glass windows, tools that promised to conquer nature through brute force and abundant fuel. But they hadn't yet developed the insulation materials, central heating systems, or energy abundance that would eventually make those promises real. They were caught in a gap, advanced enough to reject ancient earth-shelter techniques as primitive, but not advanced enough to actually stay warm efficiently. They burned forests to heat poorly insulated boxes and still froze. Lars bridged that gap. He used modern tools, saws, iron implements, lime mortar, to implement ancient wisdom. He didn't reject progress. He completed it with knowledge that industrial society had prematurely discarded. By 1900, the basement bed technique had spread throughout the upper Midwest. Variations appeared in Montana, the Dakotas, even isolated homesteads in Canada. Each implementation adapted to local conditions, different stone types, varying depths based on frost lines, creative insulation methods, but all shared the core insight. Sleep where the Earth's temperature dominates, not where the winter air does. Then, gradually the practice faded. Rural electrification brought cheap power. Oil furnaces, then natural gas, made heating seem effortless. Post-war housing booms prioritized quick construction over thermal efficiency. The abundant energy economy made conservation seem unnecessary. By the 1970s, basement beds had become a curiosity, preserved only in historical society archives and the memories of very old people who remembered very cold childhoods. Until recently, modern off-grid homesteaders, facing high energy costs and seeking sustainable living solutions, have rediscovered what Lars Ericsson proved in 1891. Online forums document contemporary builders excavating sleeping chambers, experimenting with earth shelter designs, and reporting the same dramatic results. Lower heating costs, better sleep quality, greater resilience against power outages and supply disruptions. The numbers still work. Physics hasn't changed. The Earth at 6 feet deep still maintains 45 to 50 degrees in Wisconsin, 52 to 58 degrees in Kentucky, 38 to 42 degrees in Montana. Thermal mass still stores and releases heat at predictable rates. Insulation still prevents losses. The human body still radiates 300 to 400 BTUs per hour that, properly contained, can maintain comfortable sleeping temperatures with no external energy input. What Lars understood, what every successful basement bed builder has understood, is that the goal isn't to heat space. It's to maintain the human body in thermal comfort. Those are vastly different engineering challenges requiring vastly different amounts of energy. Heating a 300 square foot cabin from 20 degrees to 65 degrees requires roughly 27,000 BTUs, sustained continuously as heat bleeds out through walls, roof, and floor. Maintaining a 50 cubic foot sleeping chamber at 54 degrees when ground temperature is already 48 degrees requires perhaps 600 BTUs total, a difference of 98% in energy consumption. This wasn't theoretical. Lars proved it through 3 Wisconsin winters, burning a third of the wood his neighbors consumed while sleeping more comfortably than any of them. Thomas Bradley documented it. 23 other families replicated it. The Wisconsin Historical Society archived it. And yet, for most of the 20th century, mainstream building science ignored it. The lesson extends beyond heating efficiency. It speaks to a broader pattern in how societies handle traditional knowledge. When new technologies emerge, there's often a rush to declare old methods obsolete without fully understanding what problems those methods actually solved or how elegant their solutions really were. Lars Ericsson's neighbors laughed at his basement bed because it looked primitive. It involved digging like an animal. It meant sleeping below ground like the poor. It rejected the symbol of frontier progress, the warm, bright cabin with a roaring fire, in favor of something that seemed backward. But it wasn't backward. It was forward in a direction they hadn't considered, working with nature's systems instead of fighting them, using stone's thermal mass instead of burning forests, accepting the Earth's constant temperature instead of demanding summer warmth in January's heart. The mockery he endured revealed not his ignorance, but theirs. They'd mistaken technological style for substance, confusing the appearance of progress with its reality. A cabin that looked modern but left families shivering and wood piles shrinking wasn't actually advanced. It was inefficient engineering dressed up in contemporary aesthetics. If you made it this far, you understand that frontier wisdom isn't about romanticizing the past. It's about recognizing that people facing genuine survival challenges often developed genuinely efficient solutions. Hit that like button if this story changed how you think about heating and shelter. Subscribe for more deep dives into historical techniques that modern builders are rediscovering. And drop a comment telling us what traditional building technique from your region's history deserves a second look. Lars Eriksson died in 1924 at the age of 71. His obituary in the Black River Falls newspaper mentioned his successful farm, his children and grandchildren, and his contributions to the community. It didn't mention the basement bed that had once scandalized the town and eventually revolutionized winter survival for dozens of families across the frontier. But his cabin still stood in 1924, and its basement chamber, stone-lined, perfectly preserved, remained exactly as functional as the day he'd built it. The Earth's temperature hadn't changed. The physics hadn't altered. The wisdom hadn't expired. It had simply waited, patient as stone, for the next generation cold enough or wise enough to remember that the warmest place in winter isn't where the fire burns brightest. It's where the Earth holds steady, 6 feet down, offering its constant, unconditional, ancient warmth to anyone humble enough to accept it. The basement bed wasn't Lars Eriksson's invention. It was his memory. And memory, properly applied, is often the most revolutionary form of innovation. Educational note. This script presents historical techniques for educational and documentary purposes. Any implementation of earth-sheltered sleeping spaces should comply with modern building codes, proper ventilation standards, and structural engineering requirements. Consult licensed professionals before attempting similar construction projects.